technology to make things better. Almost nothing works out of the box. Fiddle with things, try and break them, see how they work. We're not being afraid to try things that are maybe other people aren't yet. That moment of doing that, I think, shaped the rest of my life, because the things that I learned later and about what you can achieve, what you can do. In a recurring theme, it was about testing limits and testing boundaries. What's the end goal? What do we need to achieve? Where are we now? What have we done before? Okay, what's the shortest path, as it was then, from now to we've achieved it? I know that sounds really obvious, but in NHS thinking particularly, because I'm not sure people define where they need to be very well. I think they define where they are kind of okay, and they present problems, but they don't always necessarily know what the end state is. Everything that I do at work, whether it's in the tech bit, whether it's the NHS, is, does this make care better for patients?
Hey everyone, you're listening to one of our special episodes, a mini-series hosted by Dr. Keith Grimes called How to Get Into Healthtech, where, you guessed it, Keith speaks to an incredible mix of guests who have each taken a different path into the space so you can learn how they did it and what they do now. This is all part of our mission to make careers in health tech far more accessible, so whatever your background, I hope you enjoy it. We'll be back with our usual episodes soon, and here is another superb conversation in that series.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to How to Get Into Healthtech. My name is Dr. Keith Grimes. I'm a digital health doctor and a pure geek, and I am loving working in this space. And by loving working in this space, there's a lot of other people that love to work in this space, and there's a lot of other people that want to know how to get into this space because it isn't terribly clear to do so. So I've said in the other shows, I've talked about this a lot, and so you don't need to hear about my story quite so much, but you might want to hear about other people's stories, because to get into health tech, in the absence of very clear career paths, you have to navigate your own way, and there's lots of different ways in. So I thought I'd catch up with some friends who've made it into it and hear a little bit more about their stories and share them with you too. And so today I've got my virtual golfing buddy, Dr. Dave Triska, and we're going to ask him today about how to get into health tech. So Dave, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience?
Oh, hi Keith. Well, thanks for having me. So I'm Dave Triska. I'm a GP partner in Surrey at Whitley and Milford Surgery. I also do consultancy work in health tech, and latterly have been working for Tortoise AI Limited and Accurix. I'm known for a few other things, but I'm sure we'll come on to those as we do the interview.
Yeah, good. Two of the big names there in digital health here in the UK as well, and combining that with clinical practice is quite the balance and the juggle. So there'll be folk out there who kind of aspire to something like that. And so we are here for you to talk about that. So we're going to go back, time machine, zip back to the time you being a kid, as comfy as you want to be on this one. But Dave, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Not a doctor. So everything has been a happy accident. So actually, as a kid, I wanted to be a soldier, which I got to be, but I did it in a slightly different way. So I didn't think I was going to be a doctor and a soldier. So I did that. I never thought actually I was going to be a physician. I never thought I was going to work in the tech space. That was something I enjoyed as a kid. I'm sure you, like me, remember building your own 386 PCs, playing Doom, network parties. And I guess that was probably the genesis of a lot of interest in how do we use technology to make things better, because that was at the time when computing was just starting to advance and we were starting to do remarkable things. Now we live in an age where it does some absolutely wondrous things. So I think for those enthusiasts like me, like you, who've been able to get into the market, it's been sort of combining hobby and a job.
Yeah, I mean, that's the dream, isn't it? That you end up working in a job that you would otherwise do in your spare time anyway and finding a way to get it paid for. It's interesting what you said about building 386s and so on. I mean, for those of us who are a bit further along the journey than others, 80s and 90s was a time of, what will seem like very basic technology, but it involved an awful lot of hard yards in getting it to actually do anything. And I think as a result, you naturally had to learn about how to get your hands dirty, how to build things, because things frequently didn't work out the box, did they?
Not at all, no. So, almost nothing works out of the box. So I think the lesson it taught me, which I think has bled out into the rest of my career and life, is fiddle with things, try and break them, see how they work, try and make them better. And interestingly, that's a lot of really what's spun out into my work as a doctor, work in the health tech field. I guess not being afraid to try things that are maybe other people aren't yet.
Yeah. I know what you mean. It's like, that lack of fear of just giving it a go and pulling things apart and putting them back together was par for the course back in those days. And yeah, I suppose people are still doing it now, but a lot of the technology we get our hands on, it's interesting. The hardware technology we get really is very, very good. You don't have to build your own PCs unless you're totally up for that. But I suppose what you get access to now is much more in the way of like very, very powerful, easy to use tools to build stuff.
Yeah, for sure. It's moved away from hardware fiddling, which is something I barely do anymore, to software and implementation of software. Systems, how does it all work together? Because like any tool, they're all great at doing a thing. Can you make it work in practice? Is it actually functional for someone? Is it something you need to have? Is it going to be like the bathroom buddy from Gremlins that sounds nice in principle, but doesn't actually work? Or is it going to be something that everyone needs to have in their hand, in the workplace or patients, really? So I think that trial and error, looking at pushing the envelope, has definitely changed in terms of now it is all about those software based things. But I think the ethos is much the same, and it's sort of interesting about who's willing now to try always using these things in different ways than we have done, because we've got a set of tools now. They look great in principle. How do we use them in practice? That's a lot of the day job now.
Yeah, the reality of it too. And I suppose the other thing is that everything can be done at scale. Back in the day, if you misconfigured your computer, you just maybe get a little puff of smoke, or your sound card wouldn't work when you were playing Doom. But of course, now when you can vibe code up an app and dump it on the App Store, if you're not careful, you could cause a puff of smoke slightly larger elsewhere. But yeah, well, we'll come on to that, I suppose. But so we're going back. So the childhood, you're like a kind of gadgety tinkerer and stuff like that. But yeah, I'm interested. Of course, you spent your time as a soldier. So maybe sort of talk about how that all happened. So you're at school, you're doing these things, and then how did you make that transition?
Out of the blue, really. So it's something I'd wanted to do. I think in a recurring theme, it was about testing limits and testing boundaries. And I guess the thought process was, what's one of the most difficult things I could do with my life at the moment? Oh yeah, that seems quite difficult. So I'm going to have a go at that and see if I can do it. And I didn't know whether that would be achievable. Like, could I physically do it? Would I have the aptitude to do it? I remember writing a letter off to a recruitment agency and sending it into a PO box that you had to find from the early days of the internet. When I don't even Google was like a thing then, or was at least
Gopher and the like.
Yeah, like I probably was asking Jeeves or something. Sent it off, and then I was committed. And so it was turn up to the assessment centres, have your interviews, sign on the dotted line, and then you were in. So it was It was jumping off a big cliff and not being sure where the landing was going to take you, but actually just that moment of doing that, I think, shaped the rest of my life, because the things that I learned later and about what you can achieve, what you can do, teamwork, systems, pressure, that's all had impacts on my career and actually my career in digital health.
So did you go straight from school into service, or was there anything in between? Was it like, go from the common room down to the science centre?
Not quite, no. So I did go off and do medical school. So I kind of hit my
A-levels.
Right, okay. Yeah, so I had my A-levels and was thinking, okay, I was down to do biomedical sciences somewhere. I thought, I don't know if I want to do this, and was driving to school with my best friend at the time in the car with me. And I was going, I don't really know about this. And I think it was like the day we had to hand in our UCAS forms and things. And he said, I'm doing medicine. Have you thought about doing that? I said, that sounds good. So I went to the library at school, picked out the 4 glossiest brochures that I could find, rewrote the UCAS form, handed it in, and then was applying to clinical medicine.
Wow, gosh, that's quite a sort of late pivot. Some of the other people that I've spoken to in this situation were kind of like clinical lifers, like they knew from a very early age that they wanted to do that. And of course, my story is that I always just wanted to write computer games and play with gadgets and did very well. And so it kind of came a little bit late about my decision. But where did you end up going on to?
So I went to King's College in London. Again, I just thought, okay, where's something adventurous, somewhere adventurous that I can go? So I grew up in Manchester. So it was the other end of the country. I thought, okay, sink or swim, you'll be all right or you won't on your own. And I was okay, which was good. Enjoyed it, enjoyed clinical medicine, much more than I thought I was going to. Not saying it was a bad thing to do. It's a good career, obviously, but it was kind of not top of my things that I wanted to do in my life, although I am deeply grateful that I did. Went through, did my BSc in anatomy, finished the 6-year course as it was then, with that included. And by then, I'd signed up to the regular army. So my first jobs after that were in military hospital units, and
Mm.
then my very first job after foundation was in Helmand. So
Wow.
that's I suppose a less common career path. It's not unusual particularly, but it's not the day to day for most people.
No, I'm sure it's not. I mean, I'm sure, those people going through medical school or that now and are looking with a sort of sense of trepidation at going into the wards. I mean, this is the kind of next level, isn't it? And you were across there. So you'd finished. So, but I don't know the exact route. So if you finish your medical school and then you do your foundation and then go off in that position, or do you do your foundation in the military? How does that go?
Yeah, so I was turning up to work in uniform. So foundation years 1 and 2. I was in Northallerton, so Catterick, Garrison region, North Yorkshire.
Hmm.
Lovely area. Enjoyed it. Enjoyed doing the clinical medicine. Enjoyed doing. Had a couple of ITU rotations because
Hmm.
for the military candidates, you have slightly different set of rotations. Because, particularly at that time, this was at the height of Iraq and Afghanistan. They were teeing you up for deployment. So,
Hmm.
like for example, a dermatology post might not have been as useful to them as critical care.
Hmm.
Did those 2 years, finished. Then you go off to Sandhurst to do your formal commissioning course. Um, so we were the first run through of what was an extended time. It used to be called the Vickers and Tarts course because we have other professionally qualified officers on it. So doctors, nurses, clergy, lawyers, similar. And
Hmm.
it used to be only 4 weeks. And we were the first ones that extended it somewhat to sort of 12 weeks, which
Mm.
clearly would make sense. I mean, can you imagine going off to a war zone with only 4 weeks of military training? It did that, and then literally straight after finishing that course, my first assignment was backfilling to an ongoing tour of Afghanistan at the time. We flew straight out.
Crikey. Well, what can you tell us about that? I mean, that's going to be very unusual for people to hear out there. But so you've done all of that. You're out of Sandhurst, and then I'm sure that was tough in its own way, but possibly not quite the same as being deployed like you were.
It taught me a lot about what tolerances people have got, as in
Hmm.
personal tolerances, and also, just how far you can go in adversity. So it was. I can still remember the very first job. So so the tour was midway through. We were sort of backfilling for people who were on leave or gone home or various things. And when a group of us went out, landed in Camp Bastion, and then 4 days later, I was flown out to the forward operating base that I was taking over for a month from someone. And then I was on my own for the next sort of 5 months. I
My
don't,
goodness.
not literally on my own, people around me, but there was no supervising doctor. There was no one in the room with me. So that was at the stage where I would have been doing ST1. So again, interesting for sort of ongoing career because I guess my risk tolerance got very, very high at that point.
Yeah. I'm thinking about this. I have a wee note, my remarkable here, and I'm jotting these things down. There's something about putting yourself in a position and, a novel situation, risk tolerance, uncertainty, pushing yourself, all coming through here. And that tolerance for risk is really, and managing it appropriately, of course, not just being gung ho, is at the heart, I think, of a lot of innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. And also thinking about what do I do with as you say a novel situation or a novel problem that's presenting itself. So I guess the thought process is okay. What's the end goal? What do we need to achieve? Where are we now? What have we done before? Okay,
Mhm.
what's the shortest path? As it was then from now to we've achieved it. And I know that sounds really obvious, but in NHS thinking particularly, I'm not sure that's always the case. Is I'm not sure people define where they need to be very well. I think they
Mhm.
define where they are kind of okay and they present problems, but they don't always necessarily know what the end state is. And it's really straightforward for me. All of this stuff, everything that I do at work, whether it's in the tech bit, whether it's the NHS, is does this make care better for patients?
Mhm.
Whichever measure of that is. And
Mhm.
actually, when you start to extrapolate backwards from that as being the end goal, life gets a lot easier. And so things that seem like they're off the wall or they might be risky to try, when you start to look at it in those terms, they look a lot more tolerable.
Yeah, you do really need to know where it goes, and that's fascinating. There's kind of two things. There's a sort of personal aspect, as in my life, where do I want to go? What's the destination? And that's a common thing, and that can be quite tricky. But then actually, just when you're talking about the world of product, that question that comes up in the groups, people are talking about great tech, and you're like, yeah, but what problem does this solve? Like, why are we doing this? It comes back time and time again. And then the other bit that you pulled out there, which I think resonates with me, is like, what is the shortest route? Now, that doesn't mean you have to take shortcuts, but it's more about, what's the next thing that you have to do that will take me most rapidly towards that, a small step, as opposed to planning endlessly on a route and not knowing where you're getting to.
Yeah, I think we see this in either systems development or product development. So people, um, they don't look at the shortest route. So actually, perhaps there's a big scary step, like, I don't know, we need to procure a new EPR or something. So people don't do that, and they all have these iterative steps where things are added onto the system, or there's a slight tweak. And actually, when you look at it, overall, it makes an enormous amount of workload, an enormous amount of waste, slows down progress, when actually, inevitably, you are going to end up at the same point, whatever. So why don't we look at how do we successfully navigate from here to where maybe seems a bit scary, but actually is the place we're going to end up anyway, and we can save all of these man hours, save all of this heartache, all of this procurement that doesn't need to happen. And do we do that very well? Not so much, I don't think. I think lots of people are learning, and I think particularly as the pace of the tech sector is really definitely caught up with the NHS now. What was an NHS innovation some years ago was maybe like 5 or 10 year cycles of things that might have happened. Now we're talking about weekly tools that are arriving, daily tools that are arriving, and all of a sudden people have got to have this skill set. I mean, it's interesting because I know you've talked previously that should this be a subspecialty in medicine? Possibly so, because actually, if you don't have these skills, I can see how many times this goes wrong over the last couple of years for people, and it's a real area of development.
I definitely believe in that. It's a very active part of the work that I do, maybe slightly less insight at the moment, but digital health as a distinct specialism, long time overdue. And but we need to know what's the route into it. And some of the other podcasts, sometimes I've wondered actually, well, do we need something formal in the sense that there's some very interesting routes into this space? But at the heart of it, I think there are some core competencies. So what do you think those core competencies or skills would be? You've talked about a sort of change happening within the NHS, a recognition that things happen. Those people that are doing it right or doing it well, what are the sort of core skills or experience that they have? Maybe not having to go to Helmand, of course, but, what are they, do you think?
So, as much as I don't want to lead off with something that might put people off, but I think an appreciation of data security and how all these systems fit together is really important, because actually, you can understand the tools, you can understand what they do, even actually how they're structured. But where people often come a cropper is like, how do we implement them safely, properly? So, as a career skill now, I mean, for me, this is something that came later down the line. So I was a hobby tinkerer, which we can get into, but actually as a baseline, you have to know, like any clinical intervention, because let's no two bones about it, these are clinical interventions. So I guess the equivalent would be like picking up some drugs that you're not that familiar with and just having a go to see what happens, and getting your feels that way, which is not really safe in the health sector. So actually we need to know not only what do they do, how do they work, but how do we use them safely day to day. So I think that's going to be one of the major challenges, because for me, it's the bit that I think is done least well across the system, and even at quite high levels. People don't necessarily appreciate some of the jeopardies that this can put you under.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I built my business Curistica specifically about that combination as well, so I'm definitely going to agree. Yeah, I think you're right. It's very easy to not know about it, but not knowing about it is certainly no excuse for putting your foot in it. Things like clinical safety, of course, regulatory compliance, data protection, cybersecurity, usability, interoperability, all those lovely components that we get, and things like DTAC would be part of it. And I'd love to see components of this taught at an undergraduate level and made more widely available, because everyone needs to have at least a basic understanding of this, if only if they're to use these tools safely. But when it comes to actually getting things done, you need some specialist knowledge, fed, I think, by the clinical side.
You do. I mean, again, it's always about what is the problem that you're solving. So the bit that's really valuable is if you are a clinician who's got hands-on day-to-day activities with these tools, because how many times have we seen things in healthcare where stuff's procured or it's trialed, and the people who are doing that are not the end users day to day. And then actually when you roll it out, it's a complete disaster. So you do need to have that understanding of, okay, what does this do for me? How is it going to work? That's the bit where you get the tools that you want, I think. I think the bit where you can finally implement the tools that you want is the bit about, okay, what's the bits that we need to do safely? So, not accidentally sharing all of your patient clinical contact details with another provider when you don't need to, for example, or some such thing. But actually, getting into it, I think, is really about that hands-on day-to-day understanding and acknowledgement of what these things do for us. If we're just a silent user, you've got no voice in any of this, and you're certainly not gaining much experience. If you're an active user who's questioning why things are the way that they are, that's some of the ways that we as clinicians can provide value to the sector.
Yeah, I suppose we're back to disassembling our 386s and like trying to understand why it's doing it and getting it back up and running again. So you're doing your military work, and within that, I suppose I've got a question that's interested me about the use of the technology in the military and healthcare as well. Certainly I don't know as much about it, but what I have seen is like proponents of remote care and a lot of advanced technologies as well. Was that your finding too?
At the time I left, that was much less of an issue.
Right.
I mean, it was on the table. So I left in 2016. So we were operating remotely at those times. So essentially things were going back and forth to the UK because we're deployed overseas. So obviously you don't have every single healthcare professional deployed. So things would have to go back and forth, via digital routes often. There were some interesting moments there, which was, again, looking at these systems and going, okay, if we can do that, why can't we do? So one challenge we fixed, for example, was there weren't actually live transmissions of patient records back and forth to the UK. So things would literally go back on a CD that was burnt every couple of months back to the UK to be uploaded to the UK health system. But actually a lot of the other computers were talking to each other. So myself and a colleague looked when we were away last time and went, well, if they can talk, can this bit not talk? And actually then problem was solved. And again, it was just looking at how does that all fit together? Why is that working the way it is? But at that moment, and that was almost at the time where we first became acquainted, because that was not very long afterwards we met.
Yeah, that's right.
There was very little in the way of digital online consulting that was happening probably anywhere in the world, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it was happening sporadically as well, and I tried. So just in terms of grounding mine, I was working very full time as a GP in a walk-in centre, an urgent care centre in Eastbourne, and I was using technology intermittently as well, much as you were maybe like sort of seeing the problems in front of us, being a very keen technology user in the background, and sort of beginning to deploy it myself and seeing what worked and what didn't work. And I clearly remember doing consultations with patients over Skype, just like my patients, and agreeing to do this. And one point I had a consultation with a patient when he was on a plane flying to America, and then afterwards found out that was maybe not the best thing to do, but sort of tinkering away at that. But there were some people doing this, and you came back, so you've got some experience that sort of remote care, and that problem needs to be solved, and you've come back to the UK, and we'll come back at when we met in 2018, but 2016 you come back, and at that point are you back in general practice? At that point you're like, because I'm trying to think, how did you get into general practice?
When you're doing your GP training, you can't do it all in a military setting, because clearly there is quite a significant demographic restriction. So having no elderly care whatsoever is not great for learning how to be a GP. So I did a placement at the practice I'm now a partner at. So as I was finishing my GP training, and they said, if ever you want to leave the military and come back and be a partner, let us know. And there was a moment when that happened. And so I finished my final deployment, stepped off the coach in Woolwich, and I was in the NHS 2 weeks later, and then starting to work as a GP partner. So from a very different environment in terms of, actually I had a lot more tech available to me on my last deployment, arriving back into a very traditional Surrey general practice. So at that time we didn't even have phone consultations, let alone anything online. So there was this enormous shift from a very structured professional working environment to then something which was completely different, both in terms of how would you allocate needs. So bear in mind, I mean, it's interesting coming on to later what I ended up doing with all those years, from a place where I was triaging regularly, because we had all sorts of stuff happening, so triage in the most literal sense, and then
Mm.
coming back to watching this sort of unfiltered masses of people trying to get appropriate care. And that was the germ of what eventually led me to thinking, is there other ways of doing this? Because I'd just been in an environment where something happened, even in the worst of times, it seemed more structured than the offer from the NHS at the time.
Crikey, yeah, I know. It's that interesting as well, because I think that was the other experience I have, a lot of people have, is that technology works outside medicine. I use it for X, Y, or Z, and then I come into medicine, or I come into my practice and I step backwards, that the technology is not as good. Things have improved slightly in there. But one of the things that I knew that you were working on, I'm trying to sort of get the timing of this right, because between sort of 2016 and 2018, I went to Babylon in middle of 2018, and I was involved in a lot of deployment of technology with things like Google Glass and virtual reality and the practice that I was working at. But I was also aware of that kind of triage side of things. Was it Ask My GP? I remember being aware of this. This is when Twitter was a place that you would actually quite like to be. And you sort of saw this rising, a really interesting approach. I mean, it seems really obvious now, put forward, about being much more analytical about the nature of demand and so on. Was that around about then, or was that later?
Yeah, it was, I guess, probably 2017 or so. So not, between those timeframes. Harry Longman, who was the
Yeah.
Ask My GP founder, is not actually a clinician. So he's someone who was an engineer, so he's looking at it really from an engineering perspective.
Mm.
And again, I think that viewpoint of, okay, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Are we doing it the right way? It's really fascinating to watch that from a non-clinician's point of view,
Mm.
because I guess the message at the time was, it's clearly obvious you guys need to know more about what's coming in to see you, which sounds really obvious now when it's ubiquitous. And the nuances of how you do that are kind of the secret sauce, I suppose. But shifting towards that seemed much more natural, because, as I say, from what seemed like a very unstructured way of ring at 8 o'clock, fingers crossed. I mean, to me, that sounds crazy. Even then it did. And then to move across to, okay, the end question being, how do we provide the best possible care for this person? And using all those technological tools. And, actually, we saw during the pandemic how that can be done very badly. So you can use exactly the same tools, have terrible, terrible outcomes from it because it's not being used well. Or we can use the same tools and have a complete transformation of someone's health journey. It is remarkable about, it's not just what you do, it's how you do it.
Do you think? I mean, do you think this is maybe where that kind of digital health specialism comes in as well? Because Harry actually had some quite outspoken views about this as well, and there was a wee bit of challenge in it. But I also remember seeing the messages that you put online at the time about, like, here I am at the end of the day, all my work's done, kind of thing. So I'm interested about your input to all of that. Is that where you think that kind of clinical perspective started to shape it to being more deployable?
Yeah, I think so. We, at the time, we had a very active users group. There was lots of feedback to Ask My GP, and really it was a case of, what are the problems that I'm needing to solve in front of me? What are the things that are the issues? So, I mean, latterly we ended up doing that with another company, but it was, to me, until you get hands-on with these products, you don't know what the issues or the benefits are going to be, and where the developments need to be. So it's you have to be able to understand what they're like in operational use, which is why I always sort of laugh like these days when people say, could you demo whatever the thing is, and it's you can demo them, but it's quite hard to do it unless it's actually in a working environment. So, it'd be like the equivalent of taking a Land Rover and just driving it gently around a car park and saying, look, you've demoed its four-wheel drive capability. You've
Yeah.
clearly got nowhere near where the actual demo environment needs to be. So, developing these, I think, and this is where companies have really come along a long way, and which is almost why the sector's opened up, is that actually you need clinicians feeding into it, because you can't just build it. You've got to develop it. You've got to solve problems that are real world problems. No point solving a problem that no one cares about.
Yeah, and this comes back to co-production, the importance of people building technologies, solving real world problems, as opposed to finding a problem to fit the solution you have, and then actually engaging with people, and also balancing it in the sense that, when I got involved in a lot of IT deployments within the NHS back in the early noughties, it was all very waterfall, huge things. You'd plan absolutely everything out and then spend months and sometimes years working on it. And then at the end of it all, with a final flourish, go, ta-da, here you go. And of course, it's the real world, there are problems, but because you've bet everything on this one big thing, it can be very dispiriting. And it's a difficult thing, isn't it? Like that kind of incremental approach, that ability to be able to tolerate some risk, but in a way that's manageable, that's appropriate.
Again, the risk-taking bit of it is, I think I would say, estimate of current risk is always massively overstated, and I think estimate of future risk is just absolutely, again, other way around. I mean, current risk is understated.
Yeah.
Future risk is overstated. Sorry, that was about to not make sense. So essentially, people think where they are is much better than the actual status quo really is, and they look at the future and go, "Oh, actually, no, that seems really terrible." Even if it's a tiny incremental change. So either one of two things happens, which is there's a big systems change, which is way below what's needed, and it makes no difference, or people haven't actually appreciated what the actual problem is. So it's really great if I've got so let's say a company comes to me and says, I've got this fantastic AI tool that's going to measure how many avocados your patients have per week, and isn't that great? I mean, great, fantastic use of technology. Does it solve any clinical problem? I've never had an avocado measuring problem in clinical practice. Whereas if it was something where we were saying, oh, we're going to identify all the people who are actually at highest risk because they're going to have a mental breakdown or something because they've been ill before and haven't contacted you for X long, that's actually something that has some use to us. So the clinicians really shape those conversations, I think. And so the number of times now over the last few years I've heard from companies that whose products I've been using, that is not how we expected it to be used, is extremely high. And it's really fascinating because it's, again, trying them in solving problems that they didn't necessarily think that you had with those tools. And then actually, how do you refine them to make that work?
The other bit that makes me laugh as well is that when that situation happens, that those people developing the tools start insisting that you change the environment to fit their tool.
Yeah, 100%.
You just have to work in this way for it to work. And you're like, oh my goodness.
Yeah, again, completely missing the point about what these things are doing and who they're doing it for. Whenever I get slightly nervous about widespread system rollout of things, because it's often that kind of thing. It's just, we have this fantastic tool. You need to change to use it in this way. It's solving a problem that you're not bothered about, and that, not surprisingly, nothing happens.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you're going through this at that time, and so for my own journey at that point, I was getting increasingly frustrated, and then had the opportunity to go and work at Babylon. And Babylon was a company that rose and grew very quickly, and then is no longer, and was really quite disruptive along the way. So this is interesting. This is the other side of it as well. Is actually, part of it is like being bold within the scope of what you're doing. And then the other one is actually, deliberately going beyond the comfort level of a lot of people. And I think Babylon did that in many, many ways. And actually, this is when we sort of first met up, because when I left and I worked with the symptom checker, so Babylon was doing video consultations and the like, and everything through the phone, which people loved. And then this was the beginnings of introduction of artificial intelligence, forms of artificial intelligence that are not like generative AI as you would understand it now, but still probabilistic models and so on. And we were involved in rolling that out. And the symptom checker, which attracted quite a lot of heat. So there was a criticism online. And as I, working at the company and having spent a lot of time online, tried to do what I always did, which is engage with people. What was really interesting as we got some criticism is that I was very open about asking people to come on in. And lots of people who were critical didn't, but you did, Dave. You did. You came in. I offered, and you said, "Yeah, I'll come on in," and that was great. You remember that?
I remember it well. It was, and I can remember the thought process as well, which is, I can't really be critical of something if I don't understand it fully, and assumptions that there are people on a binary spectrum is just not correct. I don't think there's good or bad people in health tech per se. There's mostly people are trying to do the right thing. Maybe there are flaws along the way, but do you know what? It's interesting because that whole series of events, I can remember the hostility towards the symptom checker and some of the outputs, and I thought you handled yourself with aplomb, all things considered.
It was tricksy.
That level of lack of engagement, I would say, in reverse, I would say was problematic for how do you get things better and develop things, because if everything is presented as hostile within an environment, a company, whomever, whether this is an ICS taking criticism or whomever, and there's no reciprocation, then you can't really have any discussion to improve things. So people get entrenched in their positions. There's no development. So my actual thought process was, great, let's go meet the fella. We'll have a look around. And there were loads of good things that you showed me, lots of really exciting things that absolutely show promise. And I think until we apply that across the NHS, you must have done enough change management now. I certainly have, and the dread I have of introducing something that's different or new, and the responses that you get back, which are almost inevitably super hostile. Firstly, not productive. Secondly, there's loads of good people who are doing all this work. You were one of them. So it was it was a really interesting moment about a step into a different place, because it was very unusual then for anyone to be working in health tech, really, at that level, as you were.
Yeah, no, it was great, and I was always really grateful for that too, because you did come in and we had a really good conversation, and there was lots of great people working. We were working together, and actually at the end of it all, there were still things that you disagreed with. This was the great thing. It's like there was lots of good stuff, but there was stuff that you weren't so sure about, and that's absolutely fine, because I learned more about this as well, and some of that gets wrapped in as well. But yeah, as we try and all move forward, I think it comes down to me about kind of like openness and transparency at all. I've done a lot of work in clinical governance. If you're working in healthcare, you get very used to this, don't you? That when things go well, that's great. But when things don't go well, you try and, in a sort of non-confrontational way, actually learn from this as well. And this is what we tried to apply. But yeah, it can get really, really polarized quite quickly, and that always made me frustrated, because, like you said earlier on, people underestimate the risk of where they are right now. And I remember thinking, the care that we're giving right now is not good enough, and we're accepting it, but we're saying that we can't change it. That was the bit that was really fired me and drove me through some of the difficult things, and kind of still does.
Yeah, and I think that was reflected in people's response at the times, because I remember there was an ongoing debate about Babylon growing and developing GP at hand, and I think as a lot of my posts at the time would have said it, I was kind of like, well, bring it on. If we're providing a good service, that's okay. We don't need to be worried about people innovating in the sector. And I think that ultimately came down to, were we willing to look at ourselves and go, are we doing the best that we can in this position? And it is easy to, as you know, there were many bits that didn't go well, but it was easy to demonize a company for stretching the rules a little bit, but still being within them. And actually, if everyone was really happy with the service at that time, it would never have been an issue. But it was, and that kind of negativity, unfortunately, I think hampered development of that whole way of care delivery. Even now in 2025, there are still people who are a long way off that model. I'm not saying it's the model, but people will agree and disagree on should we be doing it in slightly different ways. But we've all, I think, reached a conclusion where most sensible people are going, we have to have some form of clinical triage of things. We have to have some sort of remote care side of things. Otherwise, we just simply can't meet the demand. And that negativity and lack of reciprocation has slowed things down way slower than it should be.
Yeah, and we do need to. There are problems that need solving. It's like this is a. You can't argue against this right now. We have things to fix. So there was that time, and you were still deploying it. And I remember, and then the pandemic came along, and I'm going to scooch through it a bit, because I remember I got into 3D printing off that, actually, because you were 3D printing face masks, and we're all making, doing, and mending, and there was a great acceleration there. But where you are now, you're still, I see you're in a consulting room here just now, but you're actually working with health tech companies just now. You were kind of deploying it in your own space. I suppose that's the bit. There'll be some people listening to this thinking, right, okay, this is all great, but how did he end up working with Accurix? How did he end up working with Tortoise? Maybe say a bit about what happened there.
So I think the transition came because I was a very enthusiastic user. I would not say a critical user, because then I wouldn't have been as useful as I have been. But I think someone who was using things and saying, oh, actually, I think perhaps if we did it like this could be really useful for that, or this is the need in practice, and just being very, very vocal with companies that I was working with, as a consumer, so purchasing their products, using their products. And it gets to a point where you're actually delivering things for them that are beyond the scope of the people within the company just because of experience and what you're doing. So I guess I'm quite unusual in the sector. It's certainly not a bar to joining the sector, but I'm a bit unusual in that I'm still a 6 session a week GP partner.
Yeah.
So, and have an eye on how does this work in business? How does it work in a system? Funding? Does it have practical application? Is it going to have? Because we're all about a care delivery system for a whole area. So, and that's the bit that was feeding back to companies and going, actually, I'm using this day to day. This is what I'm doing with it. I mean, sometimes I was doing things that they really weren't expecting us to do, and using them in different ways, and doing follow-up messages and delaying and all sorts of different things. And then, to be honest, actually, the biggest thing that made a difference was just actually being proactive and saying, oh, actually, what, I'm really glad I've been feeding in for this for a little while, but do you think I could get paid for my time on it? And
Yeah,
and
this will be good.
yeah, and that was it really. So actually, I think if I'd have gone through, and this is just me personally, if I'd have gone through the route of looking in the job sections, I probably wouldn't be in the sector now, because there was never going to be a job that was available. So I had very specific needs, which is I didn't want to give up my partnership. I wanted to be able to work less than full time in the health tech sector, and many people may not realise that a lot of the jobs in there are kind of 8 sessions a week. So
Yeah.
it's essentially you're down to at max 1 day a week being a clinician. So actually arguing the case for that, and I'm glad I did it, because I think that was, as far as I know, I think I was one of the first, if not the first, to do it in that kind of division. That's kind of opened up a whole, oh, actually, this is quite a useful person to have, as in this type of person. So someone who's hands-on day to day, someone who's using it day to day, and for both of those products, actually, I think I'm still one of the highest users for both of them, despite 6 sessions not being full time, quote unquote.
Oh my goodness, 6 sessions now. It's a bit like dog years, isn't it? It's like that's 12 sessions in old money, right enough, because of the nature of it. But yeah, that is such a critical thing to have. Your ability to be a user of the product that you're in there. There's no better way of shaking it out. It's dog fooding, I think is the way they described it. That you get this stuff and then you're testing it yourself. And you're doing it now. So you've done it for Accurix and for Tortoise. So this is the messaging system. It's communications for Accurix, and then that's the ambient scribing and coding and so on for Tortoise just now. So what is your day-to-day for them feel like now? What are the sort of things that you're doing for them within what you can talk about?
Yeah, sure. So there's quite a lot about clinical validation of things. So in terms of like, when we use this product, does it behave the way that we want? Does it do the things that we want? And actually, there's some bits where a lot of it is saying no. As in, my job is saying no, saying no, we can't. It sounds a bit negative, but no, we can't do it like that because, and then explaining that this is how that things work in practice. Conversations about who does what in a GP surgery, for example, at ICB level. What are the things we have to take account of in terms of who's actually going to benefit from this? Essentially, knowing the users, knowing the use case. But the exciting bit that's been for me really fun has been to start to get back into the more technical side of things. So particularly with large language models, AI, getting into the development of the execution of those models themselves, the back end of how the engineering works. So I've kind of had a swing around a little bit from being, I guess, expert user to now I'm sort of Padawan engineering knowledge.
Here we go.
Not that I would ever claim to be a software engineer. I'm not, but starting to understand how that works, and that has accelerated my understanding of what can we do in clinical practice. So, I mean, some of the discussions on the WhatsApp group we're both in, AI and the NHS, a lot of them are pushing back people's ideas, going, I mean, I feel like I'm a bit boring now, and going, well, actually, no, because, but. As an expert user, I didn't have that appreciation of some of the constraints and restrictions. So I feel like it's a well-rounded offering now, which is how do we do it day to day with an understanding of like what are the actual constraints, both in the logistical and engineering side, and also the governance side of things. So that's kind of the job in a nutshell.
Yeah. And you're doing that, and you're doing that now. But I suppose the other thing is that you're also building some things yourself as well. I know you've got your own sort of platform, or rather the sort of it's the LLM type work. I think you've been quite good at sharing your experiments and use of that.
Yeah, well, I try and build things that help people and fix problems for them. So, one of the questions we get asked all the time is about as in you and I, is about GDPR and is this
Hmm.
safe? Is that safe? So again, building a model that could help people navigate that from a health perspective, because I don't think that exists very well in the wider
Hmm.
structure of things. So I guess still hobby tinkerer in that respect. Do somewhat of the work a bit like yourself, although to a much lesser extent, of advising companies, advising practices on how do you
Hmm.
do all these things safely, properly, because that's kind of where people need some hand-holding at the moment.
Hmm.
I mean, my observation is that it's kind of like the Wild West with all this currently. So I don't think there's enough people in the positions at region level and national level with a really firm understanding of all of this to actually have things roll out at speed, because they're not aware of all the risks. So again, that's some of the benefits that day to day that people like me can provide.
No, of course I agree, and hence the push at some point to have this, but to have a sort of specialism that we have this. But of course, the needs are now, so we can't wait for that. What are the pieces we can have? And in part, it's like sharing your story, my story, the story of other people about those sort of critical components. So as we come to the sort of end of the conversation just now, and we have some people listening, what are the sort of key points maybe from your story thus far, the things that helped you get into health tech?
First of all, thinking about where do I want to be in this particular scenario? What is it that I want out of it? So the very start of all this journey, I guess, was going, I want the person in front of me to be confident that I have the knowledge of why they're there and understand their needs. That was a
Mm-hmm.
very straightforward entry into the world of digital online consulting. So I think looking at everything that's in front of you and applying that question should give you an idea on, is there something to develop? There are some areas that we don't need to. There's areas that we don't need to fill, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. But there's many areas of the day to day in most places where there's an
Mm-hmm.
assumption that what we're doing is the best and it's not. And then I think hand in hand with that is not being afraid to click all the buttons, metaphorical and literal. So trying out all the different things. So when you have your new software implementation, like, what do all the subsettings do? Do all the buttons do what they're supposed to do? Do we have enough of them? And then actually metaphorically doing the same thing about the way that things work and saying, like, is this structured the way it should be? And I think those two skills particularly, which I would say largely were driven from being in the military, because that was always there's a very firm endpoint there. We know that there's the mission and we all are pulling towards the same thing, and we have to know how to get there. And I think being able to do that in the digital space, but with a clinical hat on, is
Yeah.
that's the bit that's really attractive to get into the sector, which is you can do something that very few people in the whole country can do.
Yeah. No, it's really good stuff. And again, I'm just hearing that we're again, sort of coming back to Dave, the teenager, with his hacking things together, pushing all the buttons, seeing what would work, what doesn't work, and solving the problem in front of you, which is, once again, how on earth do I get Doom running at an acceptable frame rate to allow me to do this? But look, Dave, thank you so much. It's always great to speak with you. It's great to go into a bit more detail, actually, on this too. And hopefully within this, there's some nuggets for everyone out there. But thanks for your time today, and I'll let you get back to clinic maybe this afternoon, I don't know. But for those listening, thank you once again for listening to the podcast, and tune in again. We're going to speak to some other folk to hear about how you get into health tech. So see you later, Dave.
Thanks so much.